There is a particular kind of cold that people who grew up in cities have never truly felt. Not the cold of a walk between a heated car and a heated building, not the cold of waiting 3 minutes for a bus on a grey December morning. The cold that settled over the northern plains and the upper Midwest in the dead of January was something else entirely. A living, pressing weight that moved through wood walls as though they were paper, that turned the water in a tin cup to solid ice before you could finish drinking it, that crept up through floorboards and down through ceilings and found every crack and gap in every structure a man had ever built and used each one. It did not hurry, it did not have to. It had all winter. In the years between the 1930s and the 1960s, tens of thousands of American farm families faced that cold, with almost nothing between them and it except their own knowledge, their own labor, and whatever the land around them could provide. What they built from those materials, not from hardware stores, not from manufactured products, not from anything that had to be purchased or delivered, was some of the most quietly ingenious engineering ever applied to the problem of keeping a family alive through a northern winter. And at the center of all of it, the single most important tool in a northern plains farmer's winter arsenal was something he had already grown, already cut, already stacked in the field before the first freeze arrived: hay. Vernon Haskell was 52 years old in the winter of 1949 when the temperature outside his farmhouse in northwestern Minnesota dropped to 31 degrees below zero and held there. Not for a day, not for a weekend. For 11 days without a break. The wind came out of the northwest between 20 and 30 miles an hour, and the temperature did not move. Vernon had farmed that same quarter section since he was 24. He had seen the winter of 1936, which old-timers still called the year the thermometers quit, when temperatures across the northern plains fell so far below zero that the mercury in standard glass thermometers bottomed out completely and gave no reading at all. He had seen the blizzard of 1941 that buried fence lines to their tops and killed his neighbor's entire herd of Hereford cattle when the barn door failed its latch in the night and the animals had nowhere to press against each other for warmth. Vernon had come through all of it, and the reason he had come through all of it had started every year in late October with a wagon and a team and a haystack. He began at the foundation. Every November, before the first hard freeze locked the ground, Vernon drove the team to the nearest haystack. He positioned one of the smaller stacks close to the buildings each fall deliberately, a habit his father had taught him and his father's father had taught his father before that, loaded the wagon, and spent the better part of a morning banking the foundation of the house on all four sides. The farmhouse sat on a stone foundation that ran a full 18 inches above grade, and that gap between the bottom of the wooden sill plate and the surface of the ground was, in January, an open channel for cold air to pour upward into the floor. Vernon packed the hay against the stone in layers, pressing each course firm with his hands and his forearms, working the loose material into every crevice, until the foundation on all four sides was buried from the ground up. When he stepped back and looked at the result, the house appeared to be growing out of the earth rather than sitting on top of it. That was exactly the point. What Vernon was doing, without using any of the technical language that would later describe it, was applying one of the most useful principles in nature to a practical problem. He understood it the way he understood most things about his farm, not from reading about it, but from touching it. Heat moves. It does not stay where you put it. It flows, always and without argument, from warmer places toward colder ones, bleeding through walls and floors and ceilings, the way water finds every crack in a dam, running toward the cold outside with the same patient persistence that the cold used to run toward the warmth inside. The job of insulation is not to create heat. It is to slow that movement down, to make the heat work harder to escape, to buy time. And what makes a material effective at doing that is not its hardness or its thickness alone, but the presence of trapped, still air. Still air conducts heat very poorly. Hay material that locks millions of tiny air pockets between its fibers and its stalks, that holds air motionless in small compartments where it cannot circulate or carry warmth away, creates a barrier that heat cannot cross quickly. Hay does exactly this. Every stalk, every blade, every compressed layer of a properly packed hay bank holds still air in place the way fiberglass batting holds it today, the way foam board holds it today, the way every modern insulating material holds it. Vernon did not know the term R-value, but he had pressed his bare palm against an interior wall with a deep haybank on its outside and against an interior wall without one, and he knew the difference in his hand before he could have put a word to it. The walls of the farmhouse were built the way most rural houses across the upper Midwest were built in the early part of the 20th century. 2x4 framing, horizontal lap siding nailed to the outside, plaster on the inside, with whatever the original builder had chosen to stuff into the wall cavity between them. In houses built before about 1920, that stuffing was often newspaper or sawdust tamped in at construction, or nothing at all. Even in houses that had been built more carefully, the wall insulation was minimal by any measure that would be applied today. Vernon knew what was in his walls because he had opened a section of the south wall in the summer of 1942 to run a new window frame, and what he had found was a layer of sawdust packed hard as plaster and about as effective. Against those walls, he stacked bales. The bales produced by his tractor-driven baler measured roughly 14 inches by 18 inches by 36 inches and weighed between 40 and 60 pounds each, depending on the moisture content of the grass at baling time. Stacked 2 bales deep against the wall, he was putting nearly 30 inches of compressed hay between the siding and the open air. He had no way to calculate what that was worth in terms of heat retention, but he knew what it felt like to put his hand against that wall in February with the bales in place and without them, and the difference was not subtle. He did not treat every wall the same way. He knew his land and he knew his weather, and he put his resources where the cold came from hardest. The north wall got the deepest treatment, 2 courses of bales high, 2 bales deep, running the full length of the wall without a gap. The west wall, which caught the prevailing winter winds that came off the open prairie with nothing to slow them for 40 miles in any direction, got the same depth. The east and south walls got a single course of bales, enough to cut the drafts and reduce the heat bleed without exhausting the hay supply that the animals still needed for feed. Around every window frame, before he stacked the bales tight against the wall, he packed loose hay into the gap between the bale face and the window surround, stuffing it in by the handful, pressing it deep, because he had learned in his first years farming on his own that a well-insulated wall with an unprotected window frame was like a warm coat with no collar. The cold went straight to the gap. It always went straight to the gap. Inside, Margaret was running her own operation. She had been born on a farm 48 miles east and had grown up watching her mother do exactly what she was now doing, and she did not need conversation or direction about any of it. She worked through the house room by room, starting with the windows. The interior storm panels she used were simple wooden frames, built by her brother-in-law in exchange for a bushel of dried beans the previous fall, fitted with glass cut to size and pressed into each window opening from the inside. She sealed them around all 4 edges with strips of cloth she had worked through a small bowl of melted lard until they were saturated, then pressed the cloth strips into the gap between the frame and the window surround with the handle of a spoon. When the lard cooled and hardened, the seal was nearly airtight. Then the door snakes, long tubes of heavy fabric stuffed firm with dry hay, one laid against the base of each exterior door on the interior side. She had made new ones that fall to replace the 2 that had packed down too flat the previous winter to seal properly against the threshold. Then the attic hatch. She climbed the pull-down stairs with a flour sack full of loose hay and spread it across the attic floor in an 8-inch layer, packed and smoothed with her forearms, covering every inch of the hatch opening and the surrounding floor. Warm air rises. An uninsulated attic hatch is a hole in the ceiling. She had understood this since she was 12 years old, working alongside her mother on the same task in a different house, and she had not needed to think about the principle since. She just did it. Margaret kept her own mental inventory of the house's thermal weaknesses, the way she kept her canning inventory. Precise, updated continuously, based on direct observation. She knew that the northeast corner of the kitchen was the coldest spot in the house because the foundation stone there was particularly porous, and the bale bank outside that corner had settled by 6 to 8 inches in each of the past 3 winters, opening a gap at the top where cold air infiltrated. She had told Vernon about it each spring, and he had told her he would repack it earlier the following fall. And each fall he had, and each February it had still settled. This winter she had taken matters into her own hands and packed extra loose hay into the gap herself in December, before the worst cold came, climbing over the bale stack with a pitchfork and pressing the material down until the gap was closed. The northeast corner of the kitchen was warmer this February than it had been in years. She did not mention it to Vernon. There was no need. The barn was its own campaign, and Vernon treated it with the same systematic attention he gave the house. A dairy cow generates roughly 3,000 BTUs of body heat per hour through the ordinary business of being alive, approximately the output of a small electric space heater running without stopping. A barn holding 22 cows is holding the equivalent of 22 space heaters, and in a well-sealed building that heat is enough to maintain interior temperatures above freezing through most of what a Minnesota winter can produce. But Vernon's barn was not sealed the way a modern, insulated building is sealed. It was board and batten construction over a timber frame built in 1911, with a stone foundation and gaps in the siding that the wind found every January, as reliably as it found the gaps around Vernon's window frames. The body heat the cows produced was pouring out through those gaps as fast as they could generate it, and the cows were the ones paying for it. A dairy cow under sustained cold stress does not simply get uncomfortable. She diverts the calories she would otherwise convert into milk into maintaining her body temperature instead. Her production drops, her condition deteriorates. In a hard enough winter, if the barn is cold enough and the stress goes on long enough, she stops cycling, stops breeding, and becomes an expense instead of an income. Vernon banked his barn foundation with loose hay piled to the lower windowsills, then stacked bales along the north and west exterior walls to a height of 4 feet. The same directional logic as the house. The cold came from the north and the west, and that was where the protection went deepest. But the single location on the barn that received the most careful attention was not a wall at all. It was the water pipe. The supply line ran from the well into the barn through the foundation on the northeast corner, and it served the stock tank that the herd drank from 3 times a day. Vernon had lost that pipe once, in the winter of 1938, when a week of temperatures below 20 below had frozen it, solid 3 feet inside the foundation. He had spent 3 days hauling water from the house by hand, bucket after bucket after bucket, to keep 20 head of cattle watered while he thawed the line with boiling water and patience and language he did not use in front of Margaret or the children. His herd of 22 dairy cows needed between 8 and 12 gallons each per day in normal conditions. In extreme cold, when their bodies were burning additional calories against the temperature, they needed more. 3 days of hand-hauling water in 30 below weather was not something a 52-year-old man with a bad right shoulder was going to do twice if he could possibly avoid it. He packed hay around that pipe from the point where it entered the foundation all the way to the stock tank. A cylinder of compressed material pressed firm around the iron pipe, renewed and inspected every November before the freeze. But he was careful about which hay he used for this particular job. He went to the barn loft and selected from the material stored highest and driest, hay cut in July and stored immediately, never rained on after cutting, never exposed to ground moisture in the stack. This was not fastidiousness, it was physics, and it was the kind of physics Vernon had learned the hard way. Wet hay, or hay that absorbed moisture from a damp foundation and then froze, lost its insulating value almost completely. Ice conducts heat far better than still air does. A hay pack that took on moisture and froze solid over the course of a winter was no longer protecting the pipe. It was encasing it in a material that actively transferred cold inward. The distinction between dry hay and damp hay in the context of insulating a water pipe was the distinction between a pipe that stayed open all winter and a pipe that froze in January. Vernon kept the driest hay for the pipe. That was a decision he made every fall without deliberating about it, the same way he made every other decision on the farm, because he already knew what happened when he made the other choice. The oat straw was a different calculation. Vernon's county agricultural extension agent, a man named Clifford Bauer, who had been posted to the county in 1941 and who visited the farm roughly twice a year, had pointed out on his second visit that straw was a better choice than hay for the lowest courses of the foundation bank, where the material sat in contact with the soil and the stone foundation and absorbed moisture from both. Straw, the stalks left after the oat crop was threshed, hollow and rigid, with almost none of the leaf material and seed content that made hay attractive to rodents, composted more slowly than hay, held less moisture, and gave mice and rats very little reason to move into it. Its insulating value per inch was slightly lower than good meadow hay, but its resistance to breaking down and its resistance to infestation made it the more reliable material for the base of the foundation bank, where failure was hardest to detect and hardest to address in the middle of winter. Vernon had adopted the practice the year after Bauer recommended it and had not gone back. He used oat straw for the bottom 2 feet of the foundation bank on both the house and the barn, and hay bales for everything above that, and the system had not given him a serious problem since. The rodent management was not left to chance either, and it was not left to straw alone. Vernon maintained a working population of barn cats, 6 animals in most years, occasionally 8, and he managed them with the same practical, unsentimental attention he gave every other working animal on the farm. A cat that hunted was a cat that earned its place. A cat that did not hunt was a cat that was eating feed and providing nothing in return, and Vernon had no room in his operation for that arrangement. He knew which cats worked the hay banks at night and which sat in the barn loft and waited for mice to come to them. He made his population decisions accordingly each spring, and he did not lose sleep over them. The cats that worked the hay banks were, in a very direct and functional sense, part of the insulation system. They were the maintenance crew for a thermal barrier that could be compromised from the inside just as surely as it could be compromised from the outside, and keeping that barrier intact through February required their presence and their effort. The wind, though, was the variable that all the hay and all the cats and all the straw and all of Margaret's door snakes were ultimately working against. Still air insulates. Moving air does not. A bale stack standing in the path of an unbroken 30-mile-an-hour wind is losing its effectiveness continuously as the wind moves across its outer face and displaces the trapped air that gives it its insulating value, a process called convective heat transfer, though Vernon would never have used those words. He would have said the wind cuts right through a loose stack, and he would have been exactly right. The most carefully built hay bank in the county, standing in open ground with no shelter, was a fraction as effective as the same bank sheltered behind a solid windbreak. Vernon had never farmed without a windbreak. He had never had to think about what that would mean because his grandfather had solved the problem before Vernon was born. The old man had planted a triple row of cottonwood trees along the north and northwest property lines in the late 1890s, specifically for this purpose. By Vernon's time, those trees were 60 feet tall, their trunks 1.5 feet through, their canopies interlocked across 3 rows so that the wind hit them like a wall. Standing in the farmyard on a January morning with the wind at 30 miles an hour, you could hear the cottonwoods taking the force of it, a continuous roaring in the upper branches, and feel the relative stillness on the lee side where the building stood. The wind that reached the house and the barn had already given up half its force to those trees before it ever touched a wall. Every inch of hay stacked against those walls was working at full efficiency because the wind had already been broken. The federal government had understood this principle well enough to act on it at continental scale. In 1935, as part of the Roosevelt administration's New Deal response to the Dust Bowl disaster that had turned millions of acres of Great Plains farmland into blowing dust and driven hundreds of thousands of farm families off their land, the Prairie States Forestry Project began planting shelter belts, planned windbreaks of trees and shrubs across a belt running from North Dakota south to Texas. Over the following 8 years, the program planted more than 220 million trees. Research conducted on farms that received shelter belt plantings through the program documented reductions in winter heating fuel consumption of 15 to 40%, reductions in wind erosion of 50 to 75% in the fields adjacent to the plantings, and measurable increases in crop yields in the sheltered zones. Vernon's grandfather had arrived at the same solution 40 years earlier without a federal program, because the Northern Plains had been teaching that lesson to anyone willing to pay attention since the first settlers broke the sod. On the 8th morning of the 11-day cold snap, Vernon pulled on his heaviest coat before the sun came up and walked the perimeter of the house with a lantern. 28 below zero. His breath froze on his collar before he reached the corner of the porch. He moved along the north wall, running his bare hand across the face of the bale stack at shoulder height, feeling for gaps, for softness, for any place where the packing had shifted or settled overnight. The hay was dense and firm and cold on the outside, the way it was supposed to be. Cold on the outside meant it was holding the warmth on the inside. He checked the northeast corner of the kitchen foundation and found the gap Margaret had repacked in December, still solid, still tight. He allowed himself a single nod and moved on. At the barn, the stock tank showed open water, not ice. He put his hand against the hay cylinder around the water pipe and found it dry and dense. He checked the bale bank along the north wall of the barn and found it undisturbed. The cows heard him come in and shifted in their stalls, the steam of their breath rising in the lantern light. And he moved down the row checking each one, ears upright, eyes clear, condition holding. Not a single animal in distress. He stood in the middle of that barn at 5 in the morning on the 8th day of 30 below weather, with 22 dairy cows standing solid in their stalls, and the water running and the hay banks holding, and the temperature inside the building at 18 degrees, cold, but survivable, workable, nowhere near the threshold where animals started to suffer. And he felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but existed somewhere between the two. He had built this, not this morning. He had built it in October with the wagon and the team, in November with the bale stacking, in the years before with the decisions about which hay to keep dry, and which straw to use at the foundation, and which cats earned their feed. The 11 days of cold were the test. The October work was the preparation, and the preparation had held. On the 11th day, the temperature climbed back above zero for the first time since the cold had set in, and that afternoon Vernon walked the full perimeter of the buildings in the grey winter light and took stock. The north wall bank on the house had settled on its east end. A bale had shifted, leaving a gap 8 inches wide at the top. The east wall of the barn showed rodent tunneling near the base of the foundation bank, a place where something had been working its way in toward the warmth of the stone. He noted both and filed them away. Before the next hard freeze came, and it would come because it always came, he would repack the north wall gap and move 2 of the better hunting cats to patrol the east side of the barn more deliberately. Not a pipe frozen, not an animal lost. 11 days at 31 below zero, and the farm came through it whole. The people who figured out how to do this, who worked out through generations of trial and cold and loss exactly how to stack hay against a wall, which material to use at the foundation, how to seal a window frame with a strip of lard-soaked cloth, how to position a windbreak so it broke the right wind at the right angle. Those people were practical engineers of the first order. They did not have laboratories or instruments. They had winters and consequences, and the willingness to pay attention to what the previous winter had taught them. The knowledge they built is as real as the physics it was based on, and the physics has not changed. If this video brought back something from your own memory, a grandparent who farmed, a house you knew as a child, a story someone in your family used to tell about a winter they came through, then this channel was made for exactly you. Please subscribe so you are here for what comes next. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button. It genuinely helps other people find this kind of content. And if you know someone who carries any of this history in their own family, share this video with them. That conversation is worth more than you might expect. This video is inspired by real events and real practices documented in American agricultural history. It does not aim to represent or offend any individual, family, or community. Vernon Haskell is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced exactly these conditions during this era. Men and women across the northern plains and upper Midwest who used hay, straw, labor, and hard-won practical knowledge to protect their families and their animals through the hardest winters the American heartland could produce. Their ingenuity was real. Their struggles were real. Their solutions worked.